The screen you're watching this on, where was it produced? And under what conditions? No idea? The main thing was that it was cheap, right? A flat screen TV like this really is so much better. And so what if a few more African children have to work underground to extract the rare ores that are needed?
What a great way to begin, I know. We all know about the problems our lifestyle causes. The media is full of this topic, but what are we supposed to do? I don't write my texts on a typewriter either. We can't just do without everything and live like in the Middle Ages, can we? That's why this gets on our nerves, because there are no simple and easy solutions. We constantly find ourselves in a moral dilemma. We have needs, but don't want to destroy the lives of others for these needs. We do it anyway, one way or another. One voice in my head goes on about human rights and environmental protection. The other voice is keen to consume, dreams of special offers and the taste of mass-produced meat. Should I take the bicycle or the car? Eat an apple or chocolate? Tell the truth or a white lie? We make decisions like this every second of our lives. And we bear responsibility. Whether we like it or not, in thousands of everyday situations, we are in conflict.
This fact is also reflected in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. Then war broke out in heaven, Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he wasn't strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. When the dragon saw that he'd been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and who hold fast their testimony about Jesus.
By now, we've somewhat got used to the language used in the book of Revelation. Michael, or Jesus, fights against the dragon, or Satan, and because the dragon can't win, he vents his anger on the woman. So far, so unfair, but how does this affect us? Does the woman represent humanity? Yes and no. Let's have a closer look at this chapter. It's the woman we already read about at the beginning of the chapter, the pregnant woman who will give birth to the Messiah. How was she described? She is clothed with the sun, stands in the moon, and wears a crown of 12 stars. This is, of course, a symbolic description. It shows that we're not talking about a real woman. Within the course of the story, she takes on wings, and the serpent tries to destroy her using a deluge.
John, the author of the book of Revelation, probably understood this image quite easily. He knew the Jewish prophets had spoken again and again of figures such as the Virgin Israel. What did they mean by that? The Old Testament is about those who are waiting for the descendant, the one who was promised to Eve by God. But from the beginning it was a battle to fulfill this promise. The dragon tried to suppress it and to hinder its fulfillment, so God had to intervene again and again to prevent it from being forgotten entirely. God finally chose Abraham, one of the last believers of his day, and renewed the promise to him. The Messiah would be one of his descendants. And they formed an alliance, God and Abraham, and from his 12 great-grandchildren arose the children of Israel.
In the beginning, this was the only people who knew something about the true God. It wasn't like today. Now, in almost every country in the world, there are people who believe in the God of the Bible. In those days, there was only one nation, the people of God. These 12 tribes had the special task of telling the rest of the world about God and his Messiah. That is why they benefited from God's special protection. The prophets describes it as follows. Israel is a young woman who is married to God, but this marriage sometimes proves to be difficult. His people become unfaithful to God. They forget their task and lose their trust in his guidance. In the end, they jeopardize the coming of Christ, the one who will resolve the conflict. That's why God reclaims his unfaithful wife again and again. He forgives his people, threatens them, courts them, punishes and restores them. Finally, ready or not, the child is born amongst the people of Israel. The child, the supreme son, comes and goes back to heaven. And the woman, she lives on earth. The authors of the New Testament call her the bride of Christ. This refers to the group of people who have formed an alliance with Jesus as the Messiah. Nationality no longer plays a role. While the people of God in the Old Testament were descendants of the 12 great-grandchildren of Abraham, the people of God in the New Testament are descendants of the 12 apostles. That's why the woman in the book of Revelation has a wreath of 12 stars on her head. As a Jew, John, of course, had this imagery in his mind. He recognized in this woman the followers of God at all times.
A long explanation, but now we are back in the book of Revelation. The believers, who in this case, the woman, are caught in the middle. And this brings us to our own lives. The battle between good and evil came to earth. We are part of this battle. Since when? This question leads us back to the first book of the Bible, to the woman and the serpent at the tree. There we are told how the first humans jumped ship. The decision to eat of the fruit wasn't a neutral decision. To distrust God wasn't a step towards freedom, but an avowal of loyalty towards the serpent. Eve believed Satan more than God, and she changed sides, and with her all of mankind. The age of innocence is over. We aren't good anymore and no longer belong to the good guys. From the perspective of the book of Revelation, we are all born on the wrong side. We don't inherently belong to the group which is described as the woman. Back then, Eve didn't trust the words of God. That means she didn't keep the commandments of God. Interestingly, the woman in the book of Revelation has descendants who reverse this behavior. They keep the commandments of God. Eve believed that she would miss something by trusting God. She believed she would not be free, and at this point, humans reverse Eve's decision voluntarily. They once again express their trust in God, and they distrust the serpent. They once again jump ship. It's not surprising that the dragon is furious.
I'm in college and I have this teacher whose grandfather had memorable experiences during World War II. One of his children wrote down the story of Franz Hazel, a fascinating book. He was conscripted into a pioneer unit and was responsible for provisions and administration. Pioneers are soldiers who are on the front line, building bridges and repairing streets so that the rest of the army can follow. For me, the most impressive part in this book is the episode where his unit was driven back to a village where they'd just gone through. In the woods, Franz heard shouting and swearing in German. Under the protection of the trees, he followed the voices he was hearing. He finally reached the edge of a clearing which was crisscrossed with Russian protection ditches. Dozens of men, women, and children, all barefoot, were being driven by SS men through the snow. And these men forced the Jews to bow down in front of the ditches. Then they walked along the rows, pointed a gun at the neck of one after the other, and pulled the trigger and let each body fall into the ditch. Finally, they came to a woman with 6 children who were screaming and holding on to their mother. But the SS dragged them away and killed them before their mother's eyes. That was the moment when Frank could no longer control himself. He jumped out of his hiding place, ran towards the men and shouted, "How can you do something like that? Killing innocent children." "The children in particular have to be eliminated," answered the SS leader hatefully. "Otherwise, when they are grown up, they will be our greatest enemy." Then he thrust a spade into Franz's hand and instructed him to bury the bodies. Franz was close to breaking down. The SS men went away laughing, and he leaned against a tree and tried to overcome his nausea. After a while, he approached the bodies and started burying the dead. Suddenly, he heard a moaning and found a man still alive under an infant's body. Franz climbed down into the ditch, heaved the unconscious man onto his shoulder, and carried him back to the village. When he was stopped by an SS guard, he shouted, "This man is seriously injured and is in urgent need of help." The soldiers saw that Franz wasn't carrying a German soldier on his shoulders, but one of the Jews who had just been executed. A fierce riot broke out. The commander-in-chief joined in, ripping the injured man from Franz's shoulders and shooting him again in the head. In the end, Franz Hazel survived and possibly saved the life of his commander-in-chief. I am touched by this story because I see in it a parable for us when we read the book of Revelation. The last book of the Bible opens the view on a clearing in which a war is taking place, not World War II, a war that's taking place today. We see a fight between God and his opponent. Seen through the lens of the book of Revelation, the world looks completely different. Wherever we look, we see a raging dragon. We see how distrust of God destroys lives, those of men, women, and children. We know the victims. When we leave our comfortable bubble of consumption and entertainment for a moment and take an honest look at the world, we see them. The desperate, the haters, the sick, the depressed, those devoured by greed, those oppressed by the selfishness of their fellow men. One after the other, they fall into the ditch with a bullet in their head. We won't be spared either. We are victims and perpetrators at the same time.
This world is a slaughterhouse. Humans created for eternity are slaughtered by sin. The book of Revelation confronts us with the following question: do you wish to remain under the protection of the trees? Are you just going to watch, or are you going to look away? Or are you going to come out of the woods like Franz Hasel back then and say, I won't stand for this. I want nothing to do with that. I stand for something else. I jump ship. This is how the woman is described in the book of Revelation. People who take God's side. Now, is this something only heroes can do? Does the group symbolized by the woman in the book of Revelation consist only of people like Mahatma Gandhi? Oh, not. Because I don't belong to the heroes, even if I would love to be one. In tight situations, I would know what to do, but I don't know if I'd manage to do it. I want to live. But this is exactly the reason I've jumped ship, more out of longing than out of courage. And because I've found that it's worth it.
For me, stepping out of the woods was not a great sacrifice. It was a decision made according to the principles I want to live by, as it was the case with Eve. I've decided to believe that God exists, that He is good and that I am no longer good. That's why I follow God in Jesus. The descendants of the woman are like this. They're not better than others. They are humans who would like to be better. That's why they stay by the side of the one who has proven that he is absolutely good.
It might be that this small step one day will require great heroic deeds, but first of all, it's an inner decision. And at the same time, it's important to remember that those who don't actively take this step remain on the wrong side. We are not neutral. As a German soldier, Franz Hasel wasn't a neutral observer either. He was part of a system he had to abandon with resolution. It wasn't his fault that he was part of the system, just as it isn't ours. But we can't close our eyes to this fact. At this point, the book of Revelation is very clear. Each one of us has to choose between Michael and the dragon, and not making a decision is also a decision.